So I'm delighted to be able to present Professor Ian Goldin, who, as many of you will know, is the Oxford University Professor of Globalization and Development and was the founding director of the Oxford Martin School of 21st Century Studies, which has been a leading participant in the analysis and debate of the jobs effects of technological change, amongst many other important themes. And before that, Ian was an advisor to Nelson Mandela. He headed the Development Bank of Southern Africa. Then he was a vice president at the World Bank. Many of you will know those things, and they would have been easy to find out by looking at the back flap of one of his books. But I like, when I'm introducing people, to tell the audience some things that they probably don't know about them. So let me share with you one or two little crumbs from Ian's earlier life, which I know a lot about because we were co-students together in the economics postgraduate cohort in Oxford in the early 1980s. And Ian carries a large burden of responsibility because it was he who, when he was at the OECD Development Center in Paris, encouraged me to go to Honduras to do a volunteering assignment, which got me involved in development economics. And so he's responsible for all of the things that I get wrong. Like many young radicals at that time, Ian and I were both very engaged in the Nicaragua Solidarity campaign. And I guess, Ian, it has to count as the most successful campaign ever because Daniel Ortega is still in power. And it does give us a reminder that it's important to be careful what you wish for, I suppose. So Ian and I go back a long way, and I'm delighted that he could join us today. Of course, back in the present day, Ian has been extremely engaged in the discussions around COVID-19 and its ramifications, and that's what he'll be talking about today. And that's one of the themes, amongst many others, which are touched on in his new book, which has just been published, called Terra Incognita: 100 Maps to Survive the Next 100 Years, which presents a fascinating set of maps looking at spatial dimensions of almost anything that matters in development. And I encourage you to take a look at it. But his theme for today is COVID-19, its implications for work, inequality, and politics. Ian, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ian, and thanks for the introduction. Actually, my support for Daniel Ortega was a well-kept secret until you've just blown it. So I won't tell stories about you, but if anyone that's listening buys me a drink sometime in Oxford, I'll tell you some things about Ian too. Hopefully when he's left the World Bank, rather than while he's there, because it might get him into trouble. But yes, it is a salutary reminder that ideals of our youth can turn very sour as we get older, and certainly Daniel Ortega becoming a despot, an authoritarian ruler in Nicaragua is one of the many. But in my own country, of course, South Africa, where I was also involved in the change from apartheid, the overthrowing of apartheid, seeing the level of corruption that's occurred in the ANC, the party in power, has been another one of those, and there are many, many around the world, which is a good segue into today's discussion on COVID-19 implications for work, inequality, and politics. And I want to thank the German Institute for Labor Economics, the Network on Jobs and Development, UN Wider, who I've done many things with in the past, and of course, colleagues, old friends and colleagues from the World Bank Jobs Network, for facilitating this discussion, because I think there's nothing that is more important at this time than an understanding of what's happening in the world, where we're going, and of course how really formidable institutions like those that are co-organizing this virtual conference can engage and create a better, more just, more inclusive world, a world free of poverty. COVID-19 has been a massive shock, but the surprise to me has not been that there will be a world pandemic. That is something I've been predicting every year since 2013, since I wrote The Butterfly Defect, Why Globalization Creates Systemic Risks. The surprise is really that we're not prepared for it, because that globalization creates systemic risks is something that we've known for a very long time. The challenge is how to harvest the benefits of globalization while mitigating the risks. And there are many of those, and I believe they are shaping the politics of today. COVID-19 has exacerbated, it's amplified, it's revealed, and it's compressed underlying trends that were evident in a slow-moving way. And so what we're seeing this year is trends that could have taken decades to emerge, suddenly being starkly evident. And that, on all of us that are interested in policy reform, that are all of us that are interested in creating a better world, forces us to think very urgently in fresh ways. And I hope some of the ideas I throw out and the conversation we have following it, and the many engagements you've had over the last days, helps you in this journey as you work out what it is that we can do. But the one thing that's absolutely clear in my mind is that the idea of bounce back or a return to business as usual is the most dangerous idea. Because it's business as usual that got us to where we are. A bounce back on the same path, to go back on the same tracks, would imply that we are headed for future disasters. Be they new pandemics that are even worse and deadly than this, and that, of course, is possible. This is not such a bad pandemic, despite all the terrible suffering we're seeing. Climate change, growing inequality, growing fake and bad ideas spreading on the web, and all the other things which are going to happen if we go back to business as usual. And so we really do need to change. It's not that we had tracks that were going in the right way and we need to get back on them. We're at a T-junction. We're at a time, an inflection point in history where the decisions we make, the policies we implement, the activities we do will shape the course of history for future generations. Now, it's the vanity of every generation to say this time is different, what I do will make a difference. But I believe that this is starkly the case today. There have been times like this in the past, not least the times of terrible suffering that were endured during the First and the Second World Wars. And we need to learn from those. The First World War, as you all know, was an absolutely ghastly war, enveloped Europe, some other parts of the world. And out of that war came the idea of a new world, the League of Nations, but extremely poor leadership, a divide and rule, the making of the losers pay reparations, austerity, and growing inequalities led through misguided policies to a terrible depression, the worst the world had ever known, the rise of populist politics, nationalism, and fascism, and of course, an even worse war where more people were killed in the Second World War that then was global, enveloping many countries. Those that weren't directly the centers of battle sent troops, like most African countries did, for example, Australia and others. Why, in the midst of that war, while the bombs were literally falling on the buildings in which the civil servants were crouched in the basements, did the leaders have the ability to create a new world? At that moment, everything changed. The United Nations was built. The Bretton Woods institution, the World Bank, was created as an idea, and the Marshall Plan to express solidarity, not least with those that had suffered terribly on the other side, and of course, the welfare state. Beveridge in 1942, in the midst of the war, saying he doesn't want reform, he wants revolution. He wants the revolution in the ability of societies to care for those that were left behind. And it was about ensuring that the suffering was not in vain. It was about ensuring that those that had gone off to fight for democracy and for the freedoms that were cherished could come back knowing that there would be a future for them in a safer, more just, more sustainable world with the Now, I've been thinking a lot, and I discussed this with the historian Margaret Macmillan in my BBC series, The Pandemic That Changed the World, that you can listen to on the BBC. How was it that while Churchill, Roosevelt, and others were fighting battles on many fronts and at risk of being overwhelmed, there was a real risk that the Germans were going to invade Britain. Indeed, if you go around running around Oxford, as I do, you still see the bunkers that were built where Dad's army was going to repel these people. How were they able to envisage and build a better world? And the answer was not just leadership. That was important. It was that there was a capacity and a willingness and a determination amongst economists, not least Keynes, but many others, and society to ensure that this never happened again. And the question I ask myself now is, are we doing the same thing? Have we learnt? Are we in the First World War, or are we in the Second World War? Will COVID-19 give rise to growing populism, nationalism, inequality, poor economic management? Or are we on the cusp, and do we have the capability of creating a better world order? That's the decision I think we face. I don't think there's a third way. Either we go into a downward spiral of growing muddled through, which means more and bigger disasters, or we decide as societies to support multilateral institutions, global solidarity, national solidarity, and we go about things in the future in a very different way. So COVID-19 does change the world, and it changes work. It changes everything. Not that it is the source of this change. These changes, as I've indicated, were emerging before it. It compresses them and reveals them in a stark new way. And that is very helpful. What COVID-19 also has done is, in a very short period of time, throw away some of the old sacred cows, some of the old defenses that politicians and the orthodoxy used as excuses for not changing. And if I may just highlight two, one is the role of government, which we've seen in the end as the only show in town. Governments are what people go to when they face risk, and governments can do what they want. We've seen governments do today what in January, if you had said they would do it, someone would have told you that you'd been smoking something herbal. Levels of deficit which were unthinkable, taking on debt, spending, supporting basic wages, furloughs, banning bankruptcies of firms, giving people money to go to restaurants, all sorts of things that I wouldn't have imagined. So the macro orthodoxy and what's possible and not possible has been demonstrated to be totally malleable according to political will and circumstances, without, at least to date, although there will be consequences, massive reverberations in terms of inflation, in terms of credit ratings, all the other things that we used to hold out as the bogeymans that happen if you don't do the right thing. So one dramatic change has been in our understanding of the spectrum of possibilities, and I believe this will be vitally important going forward, not least in terms of helping those that are most in need. And the one tragedy of the current circumstances is that it has revealed more starkly the selfishness of the rich countries. Rich countries that have found $10 trillion for themselves. That's about 10% on average of their GDPs. Some countries, like Japan, more, 20%. This year, will be giving less than they've given at any time in the last 10 years to developing countries, although they are more in need. And the reason is that because their economies are contracting by on average 10 to 20%, aid is going to contract dramatically. Calculated as a share of GNI. The GNI is contracting. UK aid budget probably will go down by about 20% this year, for example, as one of the most significant. The World Bank is part, I think, of what the IMF and the UN have called for, $2.5 trillion for solidarity. So far, less than 100 billion has been given. That's 1% of what the rich countries have given themselves. This, to me, at a time when the need has never been greater, we face the biggest development crisis of my lifetime through the combination of the health and economic emergencies in poor and middle income countries. To me, this is a source of huge, huge frustration. But what governments can do and how they do it has changed. The second thing that's been revealed dramatically is behavior change. We've been told that we can't stop using fossil fuels. We can't change our behavior. People don't change their behavior. Well, what COVID-19 has shown us is that with a simple public announcement, sometimes some regulatory strength behind it, but not necessarily, people are prepared to do massive things. They are prepared to stay at home. They're prepared to give up their jobs if needed. They're prepared certainly to change their behavior in dramatic ways through lockdown, through wearing masks, through social distancing, etc. There's a small minority of people who are rebelling against this, but I think we recognize that they are a small minority. And if it wasn't for being egged on by misguided leaders, those people who give them protection, those people, I think, would not have the space to do what they do. So COVID-19 has revealed that people can change behavior, that governments can change what they're doing, and that they can find the money. And that, when it comes to the future, gives me great hope, whether it's on climate change and the need for a massive Green New Deal, including job creation. And we just see what's happening in France, the huge Korean $100 billion investment in a new Green Deal, which I think you should all look to. If you haven't seen the Korean Green New Deal, South Korea, obviously, Green New Deal, take a look at it, because it's about preparing societies for the future and a response to COVID and a zero carbon and a digital economy package all rolled into one. And I think it's the most comprehensive one. But the European Union is also building a $2.5 trillion Green New Deal, which includes elements of this, perhaps not as deeply thought through on the job front. So COVID-19 is accelerating the possibilities. And with that, we need to think about what the underlying trends are. Of course, one of the trends that's accelerating is the transformation of work and digitalization. This conference is a reflection of that going online. This has both been good and bad. It's been good in the sense that we see the possibilities of remote working, and clearly things would be very different if this was 20 years ago, if this pandemic had happened 20 years ago, before broadband connectivity had reached like it has today. At the same time, what it starkly revealed is that it's the wealthier who generally can benefit from remote work. Essential workers and many workers in non-essential areas have to be physically present, whether it's the nurses and surgeons and doctors, or whether it's the cleaners, garbage removers, post people, or others. We see in the dramatic inequalities that this is exacerbated. Indeed, many of my friends in academia and elsewhere say they've never been so happy. We're used to working at home. We've got our families around. We don't have to travel. It's actually quite nice if you've got a nice place with your own study and everything else. But most people don't have that optionality. And so what we're seeing is a dramatic increase in inequality resulting from that. The top 10% of income earners have retained their incomes. 90% of them have seen no decline in incomes, whereas the bottom 50% have seen a dramatic fall off because 80% of those have to be physically present at work. And that has dramatic consequences for distribution and prospects. Of course, insecurity is associated with this because it's the hospitality, travel, tourist, office cleaning, security, etc., jobs which are most vulnerable. So the acceleration of digitalization has highlighted the extent to which this has distributional consequences, and we are just beginning to see how these may play through. Now, what's interesting about remote work for professionals, at this stage, it's been about people that used to be in the banks and the lawyers' offices, the design offices, working from home and finding they can do that quite effectively in their suburban homes or in their second homes. Indeed, I know some people that have gone to sunnier places, like Ian's gone to Yorkshire, to take advantage of this. But it begs the question, why, if you're going to be working remotely, don't you employ cheaper people? Why, if you're not going to have to be physically present, why be in the country at all? Can't the lawyers' jobs that are being paid £1,000 or euros or dollars an hour be done by someone in the Philippines or South Africa for $10, for a hundredth of that value? Couldn't they do at least most of the job? Or an architect or a banker? And I think this will accelerate what Richard Baldwin has talked about, which is the globalization of professional services and a race to the bottom in pricing of professional services. So it's not just those that are at lower income that are vulnerable to digitalization in the medium term, although I think in the short term, they have been. For lower income earners, there are dramatic questions. I do think that we are likely to see a permanent dislocation of offices away from the type of use that they've had now. I think we're likely to see a permanent decline in demand for office space, and with that, all the associated people that support them, from the baristas and the cleaners to, of course, the builders of the buildings and everyone else. And that is going to lead to a repricing of space, of location, and of course, of jobs. I think the future for people who are not able to be part of the digital economy is extremely challenged. Now, how this plays through will depend on the intersection not only of technologies, but also demography. And of course, it happens to be the case that many of the richer countries have rapidly declining workforces. Certainly that's true of Europe, where the workforce will decline by about 25% over the next 25 years without migration. That's just on the basis of domestic supply. And the same is true of China and some Latin American countries and many Eastern European countries, where the fertility rates are the lowest in the world. But it's not true of Africa and many other low-income countries. And those, I believe, have the biggest challenge that we face. My colleagues in the group I started in Oxford on the future of work, Carl Frey, Michael Osborne, and others, have suggested that about 40% of jobs in Europe are vulnerable to machine intelligence, artificial intelligence, and so on over the next 20 years or so, about 45 to 50% of US jobs, and higher shares of jobs in many developing countries. What we need to appreciate is that anything that's repetitive and rules-based that doesn't require dexterity or empathy increasingly can be done by machines. And in my BBC series, which is called Will AI Kill Development? My answer is it does pose a severe threat. And I interviewed many people around what the technologies are moving to and what the response can be. Globalization, as we know it today, in many respects on supply chains, was built on the idea that you would have manufacturing and services in terms of call centers, back offices of banks, of legal firms, of institutions like the World Bank. The paper pushing would be done at low-cost locations, as well as the manufacturing of many products and services. That analysis needs to be radically altered now, because those services in the services area increasingly will be done by machines in the cloud. Digital processing of payment systems, of legal systems, and automated call centers, for example, are already getting higher customer satisfaction ratings than people's call centers. What will happen to the 1.6 million people in the Philippines who work in these outsourced digital services, and many elsewhere in call centers and back offices in Bangalore, in Cape Town, and around Mexico and around the world? And then manufacturing, we have to ask ourselves similar questions. I looked in my program at something called a Sobot, a machine which was invented with money from DARPA, the US research establishment, by Georgia Tech, because the US wanted to become independent of imported supplies for its military uniforms. This machine can produce 300,000 T-shirts a year. A factory full of these machines can probably produce all the US's T-shirts in a year. This is the future of manufacturing, of services, of shoemaking. The mini factory up the road from me, where Ian and I used to go when we were students, that used to have 24,000 workers. Today it has 1,000. Just manning these machines, womaning these machines. There are a million different varieties of minis produced by this machine. Individuals can customize anything. The colors, the trim, the size of the steering wheel, everything else. That is not done on human production lines. That's done by these dance of these machines. So the question for the future is, what are the middle rungs of the development ladder? When repetitive rules-based tasks, which we always saw as the basis of transition from unskilled to skilled societies, get removed. There's certainly no East Asian tigers, flying geese, or whatever you want to call it, model, which I believe can be scaled and be replicable for African countries or Latin American countries that are low income or even middle income. So what is the future of work? And that is a crucial question. Now, people suggest that globalization has been set back, that COVID-19 has accelerated deglobalization. And I want to suggest the opposite, that in fact, what COVID-19 has accelerated the transformation of globalization, but it has not set it back. It's pushed it even further ahead. And this will continue. And we can go through the different dimensions of globalization to illustrate this. The most significant is the globalization of ideas. That's what drives history. And of course, as we've seen in our daily fixation with the spread of COVID-19, the possibilities of vaccines, which are massive scientific collaborations globally, our reading of the WHO and other guidelines is that we are more aware, interested, and conscious and following global events than ever before in our lifetimes. Why is it that Mongolia has 0 deaths from COVID-19, Vietnam 1, New Zealand a few, and in the US and Brazil, such disasters, and the different states of the US, such different situations as in Brazil? That is globalization. And why are we so interested in where the vaccines are and where they're coming from? That is globalization. Black Lives Matter protests spreading to over 100 countries in 2 days. That's globalization, as was Me Too, the Extinction Rebellion, Climate Fridays, and all the other movements. Fake news spreading, an anti-vaccination movement spreading, bad things spreading, COVID-19 itself, the super spreading of the bads through airport hubs. That's globalization. So it's the ideas, it's the spreading, digitally, physically. Supply chains are transforming dramatically, but in ways that were happening anyway. And again, this has been accelerated. And the reasons are to do with the transformation of work. So when things are done by machines increasingly and in the cloud, they're not done elsewhere. They're either done in the basement of your building or up in the cloud above it. And of course, the comparative advantage of skilled people and of machines is in rich countries. Capital is cheaper in rich countries. If you're going to have an automated T-shirt maker or anything else, you wouldn't put it in a poor country with intermittent electricity, very high import duties on machines and high cost of capital and a few skilled people. You would put it in your backyard. In a rich country close to the market where capital is cheap, where there are lots of skilled technicians and spare parts. And that's what's going to happen increasingly. And that changes supply chains. So the first reason why supply chains are moving is because of the acceleration of the move of technology on production and services methods. The second is individualization and customization. The mini example I gave you, but it's happening in other domains as well. For example, increasingly, pharmaceuticals will be individualized. They will not be generic. They will be according to our own individual needs and DNA. Printed on 3D printers. The only question that I don't have the answer to is where will those printers be? Will they be in our houses? Will they be in the local CVS or pharmacy? Will they be produced by Amazon? Who's going to make them? But that they won't be shipped in large quantities from the other side of the world, that is certain. Individualization of everything, including our bodies, individualized sizes to our garments and others. The third trend, which is bringing things back closer to home, is immediacy of delivery. We want to go online and order something, and we want it delivered today, maybe tomorrow at a push, but not in 2 weeks coming in a container from the other side of the world if we're lucky. And that brings production closer to home. And the fourth trend, of course, is the politics, the nationalism and protectionism. As unemployment rises, as politicians use the Twitter sphere and other social media to try and make argument, they say these jobs must come, these jobs must come home. We don't want them elsewhere. Of course, what's going to come home is not jobs, it's machines. It's capital intensive, not labor intensive. And to the extent it's labor intensive, it's skilled labor intensive. And that further widens the inequalities domestically. Now, a very interesting question, which I've had 3 of my postdocs work on in our group on technological and economic change for the last 2 years, is why, if there's all this technological change, is productivity stagnating? How do we understand what I'm arguing, which is the acceleration of technological change with the stagnation of efficiency and productivity? How does one reconcile these two apparently very different things? And the short answer is, despite having these great people do a thorough literature review, and that's on the Oxford Martin School programs website, that's the program on technological and economic change. You can look at our working paper there. We reviewed 22 different reasons why this might be possible, and there's a whole series of different groups of academics who are pushing different explanations. There's a set around mismeasurement, that actually we don't measure the digital economy properly, that most things are free, that the services have got cheaper, and therefore this is not reflected in value. Or the value of output, and that explains the productivity paradox. We pay the same for our telephones today than we did 50 years ago or 20 years ago, but we're getting a completely different bundle of goods and services for it that aren't priced properly. So one is the sort of free goods hypothesis. Another is the catch-up hypothesis, that actually it's all happening, but it takes a very long time for business processes to adjust, and this to be reflected in statistics. Another set of explanations around labor markets, that they're very sticky, that only a few people are taking on the new skills, that they are located specifically in the dynamic cities. And if you look at the productivity rates in dynamic cities, you see technological change, but not in the rest of countries. And I think there's a lot in that particular explanation. There's another set of explanations around ideas to do with patents, and that patents are being tied up, and that there's a very small fraction of companies that are benefiting, and that what we need is reform of regulatory competition and other environments, and particularly intellectual property environments. Some focus on the competition policy in regulatory environments, arguing that basically the superstar firms are vacuum cleaning innovation. And that there's a smaller and smaller pinnacle of dynamism, a vast wastelands of companies that aren't. And that allied to this is an argument that monetary easing and cheap credit and central bank tolerance, together with private banking tolerance, have allowed more and more zombie firms to exist. In other words, creative destruction is being slowed down by monetary policy, cheapness of credit, and by tolerance for inefficiency and bankruptcy. And that, of course, has been accelerated by COVID-19. All of these explanations together don't provide you with an explanation why productivity is about a third today of what it was in the pre-1990 period. And so we have this paradox that productivity slows down. And I have another explanation, which is around inequality. That a smaller and smaller group of people are actually developing the skills, the mobility, and the technologies in terms of the software, their ability, their skills to make use fully of this. And this ties in with this fact that some people have benefited and others lost out from digitalization. And inequality increasingly is spatially defined. And not only by which country you are born in, but which postcode within that country you are born in. And this is becoming starker and starker. Far from the world becoming flat as my friend Tom Friedman suggested would, or the death of distance, as Frances Cairncross, then the managing director of The Economist, in her book of that title, suggested it would happen, the death of distance, or the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama suggested, would be heralded in by globalization. The world has become more spiky, more mountainous, more cliff edges to it, more rugged. Globalization has concentrated advantage and disadvantage. It's pooled the disadvantage. It's allowed the rich to soar to new heights of privilege and of distance from the poor in everything and every manner of living. Escape the pollution, escape the health crises, etc. And we see this in the very differential impact of COVID-19 on health outcomes according to income groups and ethnic groups. Why has globalization led to a more spiky spatial world? Why does place matter more than ever, despite all these promises of the contrary? And the answer, I believe, has to do with the fact that when things change more rapidly, people get left behind more quickly. And unless one shows solidarity, unless one is able to bring society along, unless one has the strong safety nets, this gets increasingly bifurcated. Angus Deaton, of course, with Anne Case, have written brilliantly about the diseases of despair of places that are left behind. The opioid, suicide, divorce, crime, and other epidemics that characterize the Midwest of the US cities that have been left behind as manufacturing has declined. Why don't these people just up and go? Why don't they go to San Francisco and get a job? Unemployment until COVID was virtually zero there. And the answer is some do, and you see them on the streets. They can't afford the houses. One of the most shocking sights I saw when I visited Google was the number of people sleeping in their cars in the streets outside. These are people that work at Google sleeping in their cars because they can't afford housing in that area. And they're the lucky ones to have jobs. So housing markets, transport, and other dimensions of work are important and cannot be differentiated from the discussions on work itself, from education, and from others. And all of this has a political dimension. My group on the future of work have done regressions showing that people that were more vulnerable to automation were more likely to vote for Trump and were more likely to vote for Brexit. People feel vulnerable. And that's why safety nets and what is done with them is vitally important. It's no accident that the countries with the strongest safety nets, like Denmark and some of the Scandinavian countries, also have the highest levels of productivity and dynamism. Far from safety nets leading to lazy societies or complacency, as is often suggested by its detractors, it leads to more dynamic societies. People are prepared to take risks. People are prepared to move. People are prepared to try new things when there's a safety net. And they're prepared to support political parties that believe in safety nets and strong and comprehensive welfare states. So COVID-19 is related to domestic solidarity and international solidarity. It's related to the future of globalization and the future of work. And my hope is that by seeing how it is laid bare and compressed, revealed the stark fault lines in our society, it will galvanize us all to deeper thinking and to greater action. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ian, for very, very profound reflections on where we are and where we might be going. If anybody has questions or comments that they'd like to make, please put them into the chat function and then I'll relay them to Ian. There are a couple of questions there already. So let me start with one of them. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to ask a question of my own, and then I'm going to read a couple of questions that are on the chat here, and they're kind of related to one another. This thing about the death of Keynesianism and the government, sorry, we're all Keynesians now, sorry, I said that completely wrong. The death of fiscal orthodoxy is buzzing around, and certainly in the OECD it's evident and indisputable. But what about in developing countries? What are the constraints to the abilities of governments to use public policies financed by deficits and monetary expansions in settings where, for small open economies with balance of payments constraints, what would we expect to happen, and how can we deal with that? So then let me add to that a question from Tamiselvan Geetharmaran, who asks, and could increasing lending to less than optimal governments actually result in negative impacts in the long term? What happens when governments are really poor governments, and what are the risks of this? And related to that, then, should institutions like the World Bank be taking into account the political climate and governance system of borrowing countries before they provide resources to help governments to ramp up their interventions to deal with the problems that you're working with? So that let me let you respond to that while we collect some more questions which are buzzing in at the moment.
Thanks, Ian, and to those of you that have posed the questions. And they're certainly questions I would have been the first to put my hand up when I was head of policy at the World Bank Group in objection to to the things that I've just said. So absolutely right. I think it is clear that developing countries, obviously particularly poor ones, the ones with large debt overhangs, weak incomes, are on a totally different situation to the rich countries. Firstly, they cannot print their own money. They mainly have to rely on foreign money, and their currencies have gone down by about 25% on average, and their income earning capability has gone down as tourism, commodity, remittance, and other income sources have gone down. Foreign currency sources have gone down. So it would be irresponsible for a world banker or anyone they should simply take on massive levels of debt. So I think this has to be part of an understanding that we are in the biggest development disaster in our lifetimes, health and economic emergency. And it has to be associated with a very deep restructuring of debt. I believe that there should be a debt write-off. I believe there should be grants, not loans, and that we should be thinking IDA terms at the very, very worst. So clearly, we cannot be giving a whole lot of new money to countries and expect them, given that their fiscal situation has deteriorated precipitously, to not be negatively affected in terms of their credit ratings, their future borrowing capacity, or anything else. In terms of conditionalities and should we only do this to poor countries, I believe the only condition of lending should be that it goes to address the impact of COVID-19 on the health side and the economic side. It goes to create a safety net so that people do not die of starvation and poverty. It goes to try and create a capacity to rebuild the health systems. Of course, there's been a massive neglect of non-COVID related health issues, whether it's malaria, cholera, vaccinations, or anything else, because of the herding into COVID-19, which is understandable, but is very negative on other health outcomes. So my condition would be COVID repair, health and economic, and it would be grant, essentially, not debt. And that's where I think solidarity comes in. That this has to come from part of this 10 trillion or an additional amount given by the rich countries. If this is off the balance sheet of the IMF and the World Bank on normal terms, that becomes unsustainable. So should it be given to poor governments, poor governance? Clearly, if this is going to go to Swiss bank accounts, it shouldn't be given. But as long as it's going to go to meet the needs of poor people, even in countries that are terrible, I believe if that can be assured, the money should go, because we cannot have on our conscience that we could have helped people in this hour of need and haven't done so. So I believe we need to think in new ways as a crisis manager. This is more like humanitarian aid in many respects than it is a normal World Bank country lending program or IMF lending program. The IMF, by the way, has already accepted this. I've been quite amazed by how the board acting remotely, the staff acting remotely, have waived all their conditions except the fiduciary responsibility, in other words, money not going to corrupt sources, and are processing over 70 loans. That is amazing for the IMF. The World Bank needs to do the same.
Okay, let me collect 2 or 3 further questions. This will be the last batch. We have another 5 minutes before the session ends. So let me read them quickly through to you. Firstly, there's a request from Gary Fields that you'll probably see in the chat, which is to ask you to post a link to the working paper that
yeah, let me see if I'm capable of doing 2 things at once and doing that while we talk.
See if you can do that. Then there is a question from Martha Chen, who asks, what about the future of the people who provide essential goods and services, the health workers, food industry workers, housing, waste collection, transport, all of these jobs that demand physical presence? Do we need special provisions for them via the COVID and jobs after COVID? And there's a question, or really, yes, it is a question from Piotr Lewandowski, who comments that, responding to many of the challenges that you've mentioned, such as climate change, the tax preference towards capital in rich countries, tax avoidance, all of these things require coordinated international action. But the international institutions seem to be weaker than they used to be, and we have a situation where large countries are deliberately undermining collective action, whether it be in climate or in trade or in health. What are the solutions to that conundrum? Let me leave you with those. That's enough, and you have 4 minutes. So,
all right. Well, who needs more to solve the world's problems? So the essential workers point is absolutely right. I think what, in the UK, we've had this clap hands for health workers on Thursday evenings. Everyone feels great solidarity and very good about health workers and essential workers, but are we prepared to pay them? Are we prepared to give them the terms and conditions? Are we prepared to increase their safety? Many of them have terrible equipment to protect themselves against COVID. Very, very basic, if at all. And the same is true of other essential workers. We're recognizing that having our garbage collected is essential, but are we prepared to have it? Having the lights on is essential. So many things are essential. Food on our shelves is essential. And I hope that leads to different pricing. Are we prepared to pay essential workers what we would pay the military who take risks? We pay them always high wages, even when they're not at war, because they have a risky occupation. And maybe we can rethink the way we think about essential workers for that reason. Coordinated action point is absolutely right. This is count at a particularly bad time. The withdrawal from institutions when they needed most is, I believe, a terrible thing. But we need to think about what we can do about it, not only bemoan it. And most actions require a small set of actors. So I think the term global in global governance is part of the problem often. Pandemics are unusual because they can come from anywhere, but most other challenges we face, a small set of actors, and they're often not only governments, they're also cities, they're communities, they're companies, can be a large part of the solution. And I'm thinking there, for example, of climate change, where a dozen countries account for 80% of emissions. In the US, the states, cities, and companies that have already agreed to act account for 80% of emissions, even if the federal government doesn't respond. Antibiotic resistance and other areas. So I think what we should do in this situation is, of course, struggle and work to create a more effective multilateral system. But we cannot let the failure of that to exist stop us in building coalitions of the working to solve problems wherever we can, at whatever level we can.
Thank you very much, Ian. So,
I've even given you a minute back.
A clarion call to all of us who are listening, and I think that many of us would be very, very sympathetic.
I posted my link to the
yes, I was about to give you credit for multitasking. So Ian has posted in the chat a link to the paper on why is productivity slowing down that Gary Fields had asked him to do. So so his productivity, at least during that minute, was speeding up. So thanks everybody for joining the session. Thanks especially to Ian for his presentation and his, as ever, provocative and stimulating point of view.